So yes, hello. My name is James Robson. I'm senior curator of Sea Life London Aquarium, and I'm also the chair of the Biarza Aquarium Working Group. So for those who don't know, Biarza, British and Irish Association of Zoos and Aquariums. So essentially their role is very much coordinating zoos and aquariums, sharing knowledge, and also petitioning the government. So in these sort of trying times through COVID, they've been really immensely important. So this talk I'm going to go through is we're going to talk about what happened to zoos and aquariums through the pandemic. We're also going to touch on how the collections have had to adapt to be ready to reopen, what the likely impact is going to be of the industry or on the industry moving forward, and then finally talking about what the industry will be looking for when recruiting. And this is going to be very much a sort of helicopter talk. It's going to be very top line. If guys want more specific information, we are doing much more specific talks on some of these issues directly to the zoo community. But if they are of interest to you, I can point you guys to where you can find those talks. So to begin with, what happened to zoos and aquariums when COVID hit? Well, we stayed open to begin with, but then obviously till middle of March, towards the end of March, public government advice was obviously to shut attractions like zoos and aquariums, and we responded immediately. So we already saw a tail off in numbers. There was concerns for our own staff welfare as much as anything else, and that led to a fairly early shutting of the attractions. And that was all the way across UK and Ireland. Then the next kind of step as COVID kind of took a grip of the country, and we got a real idea that it's not going to be something that's going to be over within a couple of weeks. When we shut originally, everybody was kind of thinking a couple of weeks, 2-3 weeks, and then we'll be good to reopen. It's great news. We can, repair things, paint stuff. It's not ideal, but actually it's a nice breath opportunity to improve the site. But as time went by, it became clear that this was going to be something that was going to last a lot longer. And at that point, the government brought out the furloughing scheme that was essentially in allowing businesses to stay operating, in that you could essentially pause the employment of your staff. They would get 80% of their salary, and then essentially you'd be able to take them off of your wage list, which was for most places the main operational cost. Now for zoos and aquariums, whether we have guests or not, and whether we have operational staff or not, it doesn't really matter. The animals still need feeding. The husbandry team still need to look after those animals. So actually the operational costs within zoos and aquariums still maintained at a high level. So for Sea Life London Aquarium, just an example, it's about £100,000 a week we're spending on costs with everything shut, with all the staff furloughed, and that ramps up a lot higher at certain zoos. So big collections like Chester Zoo, London Zoo, things like that, or ZSL London Zoo. It's hundreds of thousands that they're spending every week to look after their collection. So this was kind of happening. We were sort of shutting, and we were just pausing and waiting for government advice, which was dribbling in, and obviously they were trying to work out themselves what was going on. In terms of practical approaches from the keeper side of things, we split the teams into two. Now the reason we did that is to provide biosecurity. So what we couldn't have is we didn't want to have one of our keepers come in with COVID, give it to the rest of the team, and then we lose our entire husbandry team in one hit. So we split our teams into two. They worked alternate shifts, so it was 7 days on, 7 days off, and still are actually working those shifts. And there was no overlap, even in personal time, anything like that, between those two teams. And then there was a crossover day, so Sunday night going into Monday, we would deep clean the whole facility to make sure that nothing from one team could impact or infect the other. So it's a very different way of working. It's a very challenging way of working, and you're limited to obviously you've only got so many staff. You split them in half. You end up having to really spread out your workload. So we have very specific rotas and management rotas for those of you who've spent time looking at collection management. It can be quite complicated. There's a bit of a jigsaw, and then when you do something like this, it really does throw it up and make it much more complicated. A couple of collections went a completely different route. So Paradise Wildlife Park is a perfect example. They actually had, amazingly, staff who were willing to volunteer to actually live within the collection, so within the zoo. And that essentially created a bubble. So they were tested before they went in to make sure they didn't have COVID. And they were essentially locked in the zoo with the animal, and with no guests, no other staff coming in and out, meant that there was no way that, hopefully, COVID could get into their collection. And that also worked for them as well. So they had a little sort of mini core team that stayed in and looked after the collection, and no shift patterns. And then there was significantly increased PPE and changes to how we operate. So we had to be incredibly aware of the biosecurity. We're already pretty good in terms of worrying about zoonotic diseases. So a kind of all the teams that you could ask to sort of pick up better biosecurity, I think a zoo team or an aquarium team are top of the list. But we still had to raise those standards. So again, actually a lot of the PPE changes were more to do with inter-staff relationships. So making sure that staff weren't too close to each other, that they were wearing masks when they were communicating, that they were really hygienic about cleaning down surfaces that you wouldn't normally worry about from a zoonotic point of view. So some of the little things we did around the site was all the doors that would normally be shut when we've got the guests in, and actually when we're normally operating, were all propped open. So it meant that you didn't have to push a door open every time you're walking through the facility. So everything was open. When we tried to cluster rotas and workloads, so you would only just work in one section on your own, and you wouldn't have to overlap jobs and roles into different areas. So there was a lot of sort of detailed operating changes, but again, I don't want to labour that point too much. If it's something you guys are interested in, again, that we've done talks on that topic specifically. So then we kind of hit the doldrums. So you went into April thinking, okay, well maybe May it'll open. Then you went into June thinking, maybe it'll be July, and that now, well, we've got the word of the 4th of July, but not all collections will open then. And essentially we just kept on working. So isolated from guests, it was very, very weird. Obviously reading in the the news and kind of social media about people being bored and bored in the house and in the house bored and all that, and doing TikTok dances and trying to keep themselves busy, where actually certainly my team and teams across the UK probably never worked harder. And you still had that kind of conversation and relationship with other people, but it was definitely a tough time. And we had the additional challenge of, we didn't want to just completely go radio silence. We wanted to find other ways of engaging our guests. And the way we described that was treating them as virtual guests. So how can we interact with them? So lots of, obviously, children can no longer go to school. They're at home with their parents who were probably slowly going insane. And so we wanted to try and find ways of providing the educational resources that we're very proud of. The reason Zoos and Aquariums exist is to educate and to sort of inspire the next generation, and kind of taking a 4-month secondment from doing that didn't seem right. So we wanted to find other ways of passing those materials on, to give workbooks and studies and things for children to do at home. But then on top of that, we would do live streams. So it was kind of a real test to see, would people be interested to come and watch us do a turtle feed, a shark feed, diving in our tanks, and just another way to interact. And they've been hugely successful. So Sea Life London Aquarium alone, we really didn't do live streams ever before, because I think that the mantra was, we want the guests to come to the aquarium and learn the facts at the aquarium. If they can learn it from home, or learn those things from home, are they less likely to visit potentially? So it was a bit of a gear shift, but since we've been closed and we've been doing the live streams, we've had just over 1 million views of the live streams that we put out there, and incredibly good engagement, hundreds of thousands of people commenting and asking questions and allowing us actually to talk directly to the guests. And we were quite clever in terms of how we approached it with the team that are on site, that sort of split team. The team that are on site would be doing the live streams, and then the team that are off site and at home could answer those questions. So it gave a really, really good relationship and built a really nice relationship with that community, and hopefully gave some parents a bit of a break. On top of that, there was lots of marketing. I will labour the point that this was the absolute bane of my life, these things coming out. Let's take our penguins out and wander them around the aquarium. It's hugely popular in the States, went everywhere. I think also Japan as well. And every 5 minutes, I'd have my marketing team asking, are there any animals we can take out of our collection? And I think for various reasons, for me personally, it's not appropriate for the animals. I don't think they would enjoy it in the same way. And also from a zoonotic point of view, it's not ideal to take animals out of the collection unless it's carefully managed. It does appear to be done very well by the American sites, but it just wasn't quite as practical in the UK. But we were trying to find other ways to engage them. So there's lots of fun, active stuff that we were doing. So it wasn't just live streams where we talk about the animals. We'd also try and do interesting things with the collections and the displays that would engage people. So moving on to preparing to reopen. So Zoo's got the go-ahead. Outdoor Zoo got a slight early go-ahead, so almost 2 weeks ago now that they were able to reopen. And now just recently, aquariums and indoor parts of zoo collections can now reopen. So it's kind of an interesting time where we've gone through that doldrums and everybody's kind of put life on pause with our collections, and then we're looking at how we start up again. So there's sort of key parts of that, and we've been working with our displays teams and our keepers on making sure they've got the right PPE, they've got the right training to work in the kind of post-COVID world, or the COVID world that we're actually currently in. But a big part of that is also the non-displays team. So these operational people, the commercial team, the education team that have probably the closest interactions with the guests. Before we could bring them back and before we could reopen, we have to make sure that we've got all the right protocols in place, we've done the right risk assessments, we really planned how we can safely have our staff working in this environment and make sure it's safe for the guests and for the staff. And that led to a lot of changes in working practice. And that's, social distancing. So this is a nice example of 2 meters apart, right at the very beginning, actually. So this is pre-needing to wear masks. So imagine now, I think, certainly I'm looking at that image now and going, oh, they really need to make sure they're wearing masks. Where's the barriers, where's the markings? There's lots of things that are now featured in zoo collections and aquarium collections that I suppose potentially we were naive to. And this is something that we're going to have to get used to for a while. So making sure that we've actually really thought through, is there a better way of doing things? Is there a simpler way of doing things? Are there ways of doing stuff that require us to touch less things on the way through so we don't have to clean them after? And then also marking up the attraction for the guests. So finding ways that we can make it as simple and easy as possible for guests to navigate the collections without breaching those social distancing rules. So 2 meters, potentially 1 or less, but these rules about how far apart you can be is constantly changing. These rules about whether you're going to have to wear masks or not are constantly changing. And as the curve bends down and we kind of hopefully see COVID drop off, we want to make sure we're managing our sites in a way that we're not going to be a place that's responsible for any increase in that as our attractions open. So we want to really show best practice of how places like this can work. And that's partly to do with us ourselves. We want to make sure our staff are safe. We want to make sure the guests that visit us are safe. But also to build consumer confidence. So we want people to know that if they come and visit our attractions, it's going to be as safe as possible. And we've really thought through every way of dealing with that. And that's having multiple cleaning stations and all those kind of things where people can wash their hands at any point. Subtle signs like this on the floor where it tells people to stand so we can keep the distancing. Little hints about not leaning on the attraction. So then also adding additional safety measures. So deep cleaning regularly. So it'll be constantly people cleaning a lot more than normal. So most rotas, it's usually every half an hour is the kind of old thing we used to have. Every window would get wiped every half an hour. Post-COVID, it's going to be significantly more than that. And then we have to think of clever ways of doing it. So can you mist the area with antiseptics to clean it, or are there better ways of doing it? Or can you batch guests through an area, and as soon as the guests leave that area, you deep clean it before the next batch of guests come through? And these are the challenges with zoos that are open now, are learning. So best will in the world, you can predict and you can guess and you can kind of have an idea of what you think will work, but the reality is you just have to suck it and see a little bit. So put in the safety measures you think, watch how the guests interact, watch how your staff work as well. And if you see an opportunity to improve things, you should. And then also signs, so adding lots of signs, and this has been a big, huge part of building consumer confidence again. So we want to make it as easy and clear as possible for guests as we can. So one-way routes around zoos is a perfect thing. Apps, guidance, pre-visit videos. A lot of people are doing that. We're certainly going to be doing that within Merlin in terms of advising people what to expect when they visit our attractions now, and really getting them used to it. So it's a bit of a wholesale change, and it's changes in the capacity that we're allowed. So all of these changes are for safety, but they do have a knock-on effect on the number of guests you can visit. So it's usually, for most attractions, they're working on about 20 to 30% of their normal visitor number in terms of maximum capacity. So there's definitely going to be impacts due to that. And then finally, it's just worth mentioning about, when you're talking about reopening and you're planning about reopening for guests and staff, it's also the animals. The animals, one of the big things that we had to be really careful of is a lot of the animals are in our collections are used to guests visiting, and they see it as normal for them. And for most of them, things like the penguins and things like that, they just presume you're just part of the penguin colony. So then all of a sudden, this huge sort of throng of people that they see every day suddenly disappears. It suddenly feels for them like something's different, something's wrong, and it could cause concern. You really don't want to. You want to avoid anthropomorphizing and saying maybe they're bored or maybe they're lonely. But there certainly was a change in behaviour. And whether or not that's a good or bad change in behaviour is there's studies that have been done actually through this closure to look at that. But what we want to make sure is we don't want to just suddenly dump hundreds and thousands of guests back into the collection, and the animals aren't ready for that. And that can be things like, so for instance, in London Aquarium, we turned off all the music that's guest side. We changed the theming that's for the guests to a much more kind of neutral colours, and then also no sound. So for the staff, it was actually much more pleasant for them going around. So we don't want to just turn all that back on again and suddenly have the animals have to get used to kind of increased sound, increased colours and changes without easing them into it. So there's a lot of work that has to be done before you reopen, just easing the animals in, getting them used to the changes. We don't really ever want to do anything that shocks them. And there's some examples here with the Japanese aquarium urging people to video chat with their eels because, again, they were kind of used to seeing people all the time. And again, they can be quite sensitive animals in terms of, their job is to look for predators and look for things to eat, but also be really vigilant. They're kind of like a wet meerkat. So, suddenly bringing guests back in and they're not used to those numbers can be probably quite stressful to them. So we want to ease them into things like that. And it's nice press stories as well to engage guests and make them think about what's happening with the collections behind closed doors. So then eventually get round to welcoming guests back, and it's an incredibly nervous time actually. So Chester Zoo have done it, ZSL, like I say, most zoo collections with outdoor facilities have been able to open, and they've really eased into it. So it's very limited numbers, trying to get used to it, watching very closely actually how the guests are working, seeing how they follow these signage, these subtle hints about where you should stand, seeing how people interact. And it's not just your attraction that people are looking at. A lot of people are doing competitor visits. So for me, obviously, I'm working in an aquarium. We haven't opened yet, but I have been visiting zoo collections that are open to kind of go and see how those people are interacting, so I can essentially steal the best ideas. All my best ideas are other people's, and that's one of the good things about the community is we like to share ideas, and there's no negative in trying to find the best ways of working and copying those. Unfortunately, the sort of final and probably biggest impact of COVID is the huge financial pressure it's put on collections. So as I said, you can put the majority of the team on furlough, but you've still got to look after that collection. You've still got to pay for the staff that do that work. And most zoos and aquariums are charities. They run in, pretty much everything they earn goes straight back into the collection. So when you close, there's not the reserves in place to keep those collections operating. So it's been incredibly tough for those collections. And unfortunately, Living Coast, this is a picture of Living Coast, it's just an amazing collection down south, where you had real close interactions, as you can see, with the penguins. And then below that was a really, really good aquarium section. So it's one of my favourite collections. And unfortunately, they've had to shut because of the losses that mini zoo group had. They just can't afford to keep operating anymore. So all the animals have been rehomed, thankfully. But it's just a real sad loss to the industry. And they won't be the last. I'd love to say, it'll be fine. Now we're reopening, everybody's going to be fine. But actually the debts and the costs that have incurred through the closure of COVID will sit on the bank balance for many years to come. So there's a lot of work with BIASA and other people sort of putting pressure on the government to try and provide additional financial support so we don't lose more of these really important collections. And I can't labour enough how important they are as an education facility, but also in terms of supporting conservation and research. We lose these and it'll have a real direct impact into animals in the wild. So just to go through that again, a bit more impact of COVID on zoos and aquariums. We know once we reopen, there's going to be reduced attendance. Now that's partly to do with consumer confidence, also the lack of tourism. So Sea Life London, for example, it's about 70% of our audience is international tourists. Now we're not going to expect those probably to come back in anywhere near the same numbers until probably 2021, so 18 months. But even with that, having the correct controls in place to make it as safe an environment as possible will also limit the total number of guests that we can have coming in. They'll increased operational costs of running those things. So cleaning stations, all these signs, all these extra things to make it safe also costs a lot more. So the operational costs are actually going to go up than normal operating. So going back a year or 6 months time, reduced staffing. So a knock-on effect on that is, you're spending more money. You let less guests in, so you can bring in less money. You'll have to start looking at your staffing levels. And part of that is to do with a lot of the work that we do is engaging directly with the guests, face-to-face contact and really close contact between staff and guests. Now, in a post-COVID world, that's going to be really limited. It's not potentially safe for the staff, but it's also not wise to kind of encourage congregations around talks. So probably, again, for the next 6 months to 18 months, there's going to be changes to how we engage our guests, and that'll have knock-on effects to the staffing levels. It shouldn't affect the displays teams because the animals will stay the same number of collections of animals and the way we work with them. We just have to work with them in slightly different ways. In terms of the keepers, though, the workload will probably be higher because as soon as you bring in more hygiene and systems in place to ensure biosecurity, it does slow down what you do. And if you cluster work in certain ways and you split teams in other ways, it does have an impact. You can't do as much in a given day where you could kind of blitz a whole area, one after the other. You're going to have to be much more careful about how you move around, especially once the guests are in, because then you start having to look at, should I be walking through the guest space with equipment that I've just used to clean the rhinos, or I've just got out of the piranha tank doing a scuba clean? Do I want to spread all that water around everywhere? Are there other ways that I can operate? So do we have to work outside of hours when the guests are in, or do we, when the guests are in, barrier off certain areas so there's much reduced overlap with the guests? Every time you go near the animals and you work with the animals, so cleaning, feeding, any kind of maintenance where you're close to the animals, you will draw a crowd. People just love seeing the staff working with the animals in those collections. And actually, that's something we don't want. We don't want to encourage guests to congregate too much together, and we don't want to make it feel like people miss out. So, it's not fair. They're on the spot. They're allowed to stay there and watch this happen. I'm not allowed to get any closer. That's unfair. So we want to try and not make people feel like they're missing out. So that's probably where we're going to have to be really clever about how and where we work. There'll be huge limitations to the in situ conservation work we do. So this is some seal releases, I think, done by Hans Stanton. But all that kind of work where we're going to go out and do field work, animal releases or studies in the wild. And that's within the UK, but then also abroad. You can imagine international travel right now, and trying to do projects like that are going to be really taxing probably for the next, again, 18 months to 2 years. And then even things like this where we're, collecting animals, working as a team, these sort of things require close working environments with staff, also with the animals. And we have to really consider the safety of that and how we operate. And it will definitely limit the conservation work for the short term. So we're going to have to pivot a little bit in terms of what we do. So if we can't actively do in situ conservation work, can we do more ex situ conservation work, or can we just provide support to people who are already in those countries to operate whilst we're away, so we can't send people to help anymore? And there'll be significantly stricter control of research and student placement. So for Askham themselves, it's a really, and for all you students watching, this is something just to be aware of, that we really do love having students join and work within our collections and work with our animals. Is a really important thing that we provide access for you guys, so we can learn more about the animals and really to improve the husbandry and make sure that we're providing the best care possible for our collections, but then also to learn as much as we can that can be taken to the wild counterparts. So, with the increased biosecurity, with the sort of changes to travel, there is going to be limits to that, and it's something that you do have to be aware of going forward. So support is there. British and Irish Association of Zoos and Aquariums. That's why we call it BIAZA, because it's a very wordy thing. There's a lot of acronyms within the zoo and aquarium community because there's all these great names. They've been amazing in terms of petitioning the government, but also coordinating and providing support between collections. I head up the Aquarium Working Group, which is a subset of BIAZA, and that's about getting the actual curators and the zoo and aquarium displays teams to start talking together about specific issues related to their types of collections. And then ABWAC, the Association of British and Irish Wild Animal Keepers, which is basically a keeper version of BIAZA. So BIAZA is kind of all-encompassing, so it's the actual collections themselves, really, whereas ABWAC is much more keeper-focused. They've been amazing in terms of trying to provide support and looking for training resources to help post-COVID. So it's not all negative, and it's been amazing to see. There was never an instance, certainly that I've heard of any collection where staff refused to come into work because of the dangers. They very much were frontline workers. They knew that if they didn't come in, there'd be issues for the animals. Absolute heroes and troopers through this. So I can't speak highly enough to that, and that will continue. I can guarantee it. It's really heartening to see. So this is kind of just the final sort of penultimate bit of the talk, and it's kind of more of a heads up. You guys, as you're coming through, you'll be finishing courses or getting to the point where you're finishing courses. And then after that, you'll be looking for careers in industry. Now, zoos and aquariums, certainly for the types of topics and areas that you guys are working at, provide a really great opportunity for a kind of nice sidestep into a really fascinating industry in terms of you can work very closely with the animals, and then you can also work with conservation and research projects. And it can ease you in, and it can build your CV in ways that might make other opportunities that aren't based within a collection become available in the future. And it's a really kind of natural progression. A lot of people come into the aquarium industry not because, or zoo industry, not just because they've always wanted, or they love keeping animals and they love pets and things like that. They have a real passion for a certain taxa or species, and they want to work as closely as possible with them. And you're not always going to get a placement in the Maldives doing that, but actually you can work closely with that collection and the stud groups and the breeding programs that we have in these collections, and then that really helps you learn more and build your CV to potentially work with those in situ in the wild down the line. So it's a really interesting career route. It's certainly for me. I wasn't thinking about this career, but now I've come into it. It's kind of the best of both worlds. It's a bit of science, a bit of animal work, and then it's lots of education. So you get to talk to the guests, you get to share your passion and your knowledge, and it's really fun. It has meant I've lost a bit of hair over the years, but it is very fun. So what will recruiters be looking for? We're really entering a world where it's a broad range of skills. When you're kind of moving into this kind of really plastic environment where things are going to be changing constantly, we're looking for people who are applying for jobs who can show that they've got a sort of finger in a lot of pies. So they've maybe got experience with media, got experience with directly working with animal collections, but then also statistical analysis and doing little mini research projects and things that might help with the husbandry side of things. So we're constantly looking for broad CV. So always think about, is there anything I can add to my CV? Are there any online courses, especially now, that you might be able to drop on that don't take a lot of time out of your actual courses that you can add to your CV? And things like scuba diving and things like that, being able to drive, it's weird things that are just super helpful and really put you ahead of the other competition. And if you can get a chance to volunteering and getting that experience that way helps massively. Being comfortable with public engagement. The reality is I think, post-COVID, there's going to be a lot more pressure on the keeping team and the staff to take up a bit of the burden about how we find ways of engaging. I think the days of this where you're that close to your guests and talking to them probably are going to be gone for a while, and we're going to have to think of other ways that we can engage the public and be comfortable talking to guests in a slightly uncomfortable environment where you might be wearing a mask and making sure you're keeping distance. So having that sort of confidence really helps, and it's something that you have to learn. It's a skill. It's not. So personally, within my team, I've got a team of 14. About half of them, when they first started working with me, just super shy, hated the idea of working closely with the public, and now they love it and they're really used to it. And you kind of have to just do it. It's kind of like public speaking. You get used to doing talks like this, where you're no longer really worried or nervous about it anymore. Being flexible to your working hours. Again, this is an example where I was sort of saying about the reality is the schedules now are unlikely. There never were a 9 till 5 job. You'd always come in before the guests came in, so you could work on the animals and make sure everything's ready before the guests would arrive, and often you stay until after the guests have left. That's going to be even more so now. So there's going to be some very interesting working hours and very flexible schedules where we're going to be asking a lot of new recruits in terms of that. So again, being mentally prepared that it's not a 9 to 5. You are going to be working a lot of things like weekends on a regular basis. It's usually the standard within the aquarium zoo community is every other weekend, if you're lucky, to be honest. And then really early starts or really late starts. And it's just those sort of things that you just have to be aware of will be definitely exacerbated since COVID. We look for creativity and open-minded approaches to problems. So again, as the world changes, we're looking for people who can look for different ways of doing things, different approaches to doing things, taking on board the training they get, but then also trying to think of, are there improvements we can make to make things a little bit easier? And again, that's less something that you can train. You either are open-minded and creative or not, but it is a skill that you can learn in terms of, it's kind of a muscle you have to kind of stretch. So trying to think outside the box and doing it in a positive way is hugely important. And it really comes across when we have people apply for positions. And then trying to stay enthusiastic in a competitive market. So, you know, the reality is there's going to be a lot less jobs available in the near future. There's going to be maybe not a recruitment freeze, but there's certainly going to be a limit to staff wanting to move between jobs right now. They want to stay where it's, you know, they're secure, they've got a job, and it's safe. Again, probably for the next year to 2 years. And there's probably going to be a little less movement between collections. And there also just general movement of people to different careers. So that does limit the amount of jobs that do come up. And most zoo and aquarium jobs are hugely oversubscribed. We will have, for the average application, we'll have probably 200-300 to 1,000 applicants for a role. And they'll have very good CVs. So that might have had been volunteering at zoo collections. They might have, you know, masters in animal behavior and things like that, you know, really good skills. And yeah, I just want to say, be enthusiastic, you know, don't see that as a negative. Competition is good. And it's then a skill applying for jobs and getting these roles. It's something you have to practice and push through. So that was a bit long-winded. I'm notorious for talking far too long, so I apologise for that, but I do go off on a side rant. But thank you all for listening. And if there is time left, if there's any questions, I'm available now. If not, feel free to contact me afterwards, and I'll try and answer what I can.
Thank you for that, James. That was really, really interesting to know what it's like from kind of a zoo and aquarium standpoint. It's not really my specialty, but it's really interesting to know how they've all been coping with that during this. We actually had a really good question from one of our students. Just find it. So do you think enough was done to highlight the plight of zoos as a whole during the pandemic? Chester have done an amazing job of publication and fundraising, but it's felt like other collections, particularly smaller ones, were either ignored or forgotten, and that's from Lisa.
Yeah, it's a really good point. I think that's where associations like Biaza were hugely important. Now, I kind of got to see behind the curtain a little bit, and I saw pretty much from the week that we closed, Biaza were talking at a very high level to the government. The problem was if you are the government in a process like this, in all honesty, for them, zoos and aquariums are very low on the scale of things that they're worried about. If every zoo and aquarium in the UK shut permanently, it could be, you know, a couple of thousand people made redundant, and you know, there'll be an impact to tourism. But other than that, nowhere near as much of an impact to something like pubs staying closed or building contractors not allowed to work anymore. So there was a bit of reality of the government didn't quite have the same, I suppose, urgency that we maybe had as collections, and we were petitioning very, very hard. Smaller collections were unfortunately in a double problem. Is Chester Zoo, ZSL to an extent, Paynton. You know, they have a much bigger collection, they had much bigger resources, which meant they didn't have to furlough as many of their staff. Now, smaller collections, the only way they could possibly survive is essentially to furlough everybody apart from the keepers to keep things running. That meant you don't have you know, your marketing team that can come up with a big public campaign. You don't have operational management team that can kind of really push through fundraising campaigns. So that's why I think a lot of the smaller collections were quiet, is essentially they just had to get their heads down and just try and look after the animals, and there just wasn't the resources in the same way to campaign in the way that Chester did. And that's, again, like I say, where it was really important that Biaza did that work. And even with that, with the real, and you know, I saw behind the scenes some real heavy pressure, MPs really supporting it, taking up to a very high level within the government. There still wasn't the hunger until we had some really nice sort of resonant press stories that resonated with the public. And then all of a sudden, it kind of went higher on the totem pole of the government because they didn't want to be seen from a press point of view, from a public point of view, to be failing zoos and aquariums. And unfortunately, that's the world we live in, is if you can get a really sticky press story from it, all of a sudden things become a lot easier. But even then, you know, the funds and the support that have been provided are not enough. And so the fight kind of goes on to ask for more support. We shouldn't be losing collections like Living Coast due to lack of funding. And we're not talking about something that's going to bankrupt the government or bankrupt the UK, it's actually, you know, reasonably speaking, small sums of money. But when you're looking at a giant pie and you're worried about, I know, the travel sector and the pubs and hotels and things, they've only got so much money to go around that they're willing to divvy out. So it's about us screening. It's about the public supporting us and returning. Basically, that's the main thing. Is the best way that you can help the smaller collections is go and visit them now they're opening and buy a coffee there, and, you know, support them in that way financially, because it's going to be tough for us for the next, again, 18 months to 2 years at least.
Thank you very much for that. It's really good insight.